title of this presentation is Parental Alienation, State of Knowledge and Handling Misinformation. The first speaker will discuss the quality of research on parental alienation. We have Demosthenes Lorandos, and is Joshua Marsden going to be speaking as well? Okay, got it. All right. Demosthenes Lorandos, PhD, JD, studied science at the New School for Social Research. A psychologist for 50 years, he trained in law with the Jesuits at the University of Detroit. He has been a litigator for 30 years and is a member of the Bar of New York, California, Michigan, Tennessee, Washington, D.C., the 2nd, 6th, 9th, and 11th Federal Courts of Appeal, as well as the Bar of the United States Supreme Court. Let's give a hand to Dr. Demosthenes Lorandos.
Thank you. Okay, I'm filling in here for a hardworking student who lost all of his data, and so I'm going to talk about the way in which Professor Harman and Dr. Warshak and Matt Florian and I dealt with the idea that there's no good research out there about parental alienation. So this study, it was about assessing 4 electronic databases, and when we did this, we identified 213 documents with empirical data on parental alienation published in 10 languages through December 2020. So what was the purpose? The purpose was to determine if parental alienation, if the scholarship in parental alienation is valuable in the context of current knowledge about children exposed to interparental conflict. We wanted to know if we could lay a foundation for subsequent work in the field. And we wanted to counter the confusion generated by critics who allow confirmatory biases to undermine confidence in the science supporting the validity of the concept of parental alienation. So, various conceptual models have been developed to explain how and why interparental conflict impairs parent-child relations, leaves children more vulnerable to affective behavioral and cognitive problems. Interparental conflict and children's developmental psychological processes are particularly important, and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual spoke to the children affected by parental relationship distress. And this particular conflict has been linked to internalizing and externalizing symptoms in children lifelong. Triangulation is another theoretical idea, and triangulation is one of the mediating processes that's been studied in detail, and it leads to changes in how children relate to their parents. It's all about children being caught in the middle. So triangulation versus alignment is another area of study in parental alienation studies. Over time, children may ultimately pick a side and then align with one parent or another, say these researchers. So in order to create this alignment, the alienating parent tends to engage in behaviors, PABs, parental alienating behaviors. And what are some of the common themes? The common themes are that the other parent is to blame for breaking up the family, or that the other parent is dangerous, does not really love the children, or prioritizes other things like work and money, etc., over the children. So parental alienating behaviors are also result in child developing negative thoughts, feelings, behavior toward the rejected parent, and are unwarranted by the history of the parent's treatment of the child. Now, I'm reading a lot of this because I try to make it as succinct as possible, and I'm going really fast because Professor Harman, after getting me up at here at 7:30 in the blankety-blank morning, right? It's not enough to bring me all the way across the United States. Not enough to take me up to altitude. It's not enough to put me on the stage with a hard act to follow like Brian Ludmer and Alyssa Sherry. But it's 7:30 in the morning, and here I am at the end of the day, and okay, that's why I'm reading fast. So, children who align with one parent against the other parent appear to welcome being involved in parental disputes. Yvonne, tell me that this is the 70-slide one that's on this computer. Good, okay. No. Yes. Okay, here's the reason. So Jennifer had to speak to the Mexican Commission on Human Rights about the status of science in parental alienation studies. Now, my sidekick here, Professor Wonderful. So we got 70 slides.
Hold on.
I wrote 74 slides for the Mexican Commission on Human Rights, and they had me go on via Zoom after some poor soul was whining and complaining in Spanish about how there's no such thing as parental alienation, and you got to listen to Meyer, and you got to listen to this person and that person, and it's all so terrible. And she took up all of my time, and then they gave me 20 minutes to talk about this, and I had to keep stopping so the translator could catch up with me. We good?
Yes, there's 70, yes.
Beautiful. So I'm going to keep talking fast and get through 70 slides.
But I need to change that. Is there
Go for it.
Tech person?
To the slideshow?
Yeah, well, you don't need the sidebars, right?
No. So anyway, here comes a tech person. So the purpose of this study, Bill Burnett and Jennifer Harman published a study in 2019 talking about the greening of the field. And I thought, well, that's a kind of a goofy phrase, the greening. What are they talking about? Is this a garden? And they went, yeah. First it sprouts up and it gets green, and then what does it do? It blossoms. These are stages that scientific disciplines go through as they develop. And parental alienation studies about parental alienation is definitely in a greening phase. And so this study with Rick Warshak and Matt Florian and Jennifer was to look at whether or not it was going past greening into, what's next? Blossoming. So, am I good? I think you are. It's terrible. We hate it. Processes underlying spillover model, family systems. Boy, oh boy, that's another model. Emotional security theory, that's another one we talked about. Now, when we got this done, we did not ask Robert, your license is revoked, but we're going to stay it if you get your head examined, and you get a practice monitor, and you get psychotherapy, and you go to classes. Journal. We shot for the most important journal about children in psychology on the planet, developmental psychology. And so the rigor that was required for this study was intense. So we talked about all of the different kinds of models about children becoming estranged and parental conflict and the consequences. So suggestibility was one of the things that we looked at. The woman that did the mousetrap experiment, demonstrating that if you just ask the kids a question, do nothing more than ask them a question, they'll develop a memory about something that never happened. That's another area of inquiry. And the woman that did that study at Stephen Cece's laboratory when she was a graduate student at Cornell, Mary Lynn Huffman, wrote the chapter on children's suggestibility in the new 3-volume set that I've talked about ad nauseum. Okay, so we looked at all of these different kinds of themes while we were studying previous PA literature. Now there was a review, and this was one of the reasons I signed on to this study. At an AFCC conference, I went up to Michael Saney, and I told him I thought that he was, I won't repeat it, because he published with Barbara Fiedler, someone I like, and Nick Balla, a guy I like. He published a study about, and said basically, well, there's not really much good research in parental alienation. It's in its infancy and it's not really developed. And how did he come to that decision? Well, he used grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation. This is a model of looking at data out in the field that's used in medical research, right? Clinical research in controlled trials. Okay, that's kind of like taking a wrench to an appendectomy. Really? So when confronting Saney about that, he got all huffy and told me that he was a specialist in research, and I didn't make any friends at that AFCC conference because I wrote all over that chapter, and I thought, this is garbage. How could Nick Balla and Barbara Fiedler get sucked into this? So one of the things that was important to me was to determine, was to falsify, see if we could falsify this, and we certainly could. So the grade-based review by Saney overlooked and undervalued qualitative and descriptive research conducted in the greening phase of the development of parental alienation studies. This exclusion is unfortunate. The paragraph that I wrote, Rick Warshak and Jennifer Harman edited very strenuously to get it into the journal. It was unfortunate because it misinformed the courts, it misinformed public policy. Okay, there was another review by Marquez and colleagues in 2000, but they excluded and de-emphasized all kinds of research. So what did we do? We followed on Harmen et al. In 2019 and their idea that the field was greening. And we believed that if we looked hard enough, we could see whether the field was moving towards another stage in the development of a psychological area of expertise, to a blossoming stage. So what were our goals? Our first goal was to test Harmen et al.'s 2019 conclusion that PA research had advanced to a blossoming stage and is not in a stage of infancy as claimed by Saney. Our second goal was to delineate the contributions to parental alienation research and to our understanding of these developmental processes and effects on children when interparental conflict leads to their alignment with a parent and rejection of the other. So we wanted to get past the red herrings about the scientific status of PA. So we wanted to remind the reader that in developmental psychology, we understand as developmental psychologists that qualitative research is an essential part of the arc of knowledge and is fundamental to all scientific enterprises because it uses structured and theoretically based procedures, both inductive and deductive. In developmental psychology, qualitative research has generated some of the field's seminal theories through time. Okay, we were also looking for a diversity of methods. We were looking for different measures, different methods, different samples in the literature to see if it was out there, because so many people have said that the research is fatally flawed in parental alienation, like Milchman. One day I'll tell you about cross-examining Dr. Milchman. So we used the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis, PRISMA. That's designed to do this kind of a literature review. If you were a PhD candidate in any reputable PhD program and you went to your committee and you said, well, I'm going to do a meta-analysis on this qualitative and quantitative studies on this developing field called parental alienation, and I'm going to use grade, your professors would laugh you right out of the meeting. But if you said, I'm going to use PRISM, they'd say, yeah, that's pretty rigorous. Go for it. So we used PsycInfo, Medline, Westlaw, and we used the incredible database at the university, at Vanderbilt University College, and that was developed by PASG and in collaboration with Bill Burnett. So our initial search using these four databases got us 1,462 records. We made, unlike the people that publish in the schlock journals, Professor Harman insists that if we're going to be scientists, we're going to make our hypotheses and our data available on the open science framework. Why? Because we've got nothing to hide, and we know that science develops in a community of good faith investigators who share their data. Professor Giancarlo talked about that yesterday. So after we got rid of duplicates, we were down to 1,215, and then we developed an inclusion criteria, and the inclusion criteria was it had to contain empirical data. It had to contain empirical data. Like I developed an inclusion a strict inclusion-exclusion criteria for all of the appellate cases I studied across the United States from 1985 to 2018. We developed for this study a strict inclusion criteria. We looked at 1,215 of these articles, books, chapters, peer-reviewed articles, journal articles, etc. And if they didn't contain empirical data, they were out. So we had 298 full-text articles, books, theses, dissertations, and we reviewed them all. We removed, again, articles with no empirical data, and Jennifer rode herd over us. Rick Warshak, myself, Jennifer read, reread, consulted, and Jennifer did the lion's share of this work with her team here, and the final sample was down to 213 books, theses, dissertations, and articles. Okay, this is a review process. Matt Florian is a data modeler, and he made these fabulous charts for us. So the review process demonstrates that we started with 1,462 pieces of material that the various databases gave us, and we winnowed it down to 213. Okay, so we coded them for publication type, year of publication, first author's discipline, location of samples, and this is all available in the Developmental Psychology Journal. This shows you the kinds of the detail that we went into to describe where did these things come from. We developed an Excel database, and yep, because Professor Harman insists on it, because we're scientists, once again, open science framework. There it is, available to everybody. We're not hiding anything. It's all up there because science is developed in a community of goodwill investigators. We looked at qualitative and quantitative methods. We looked at studies that had multivariate analysis, analysis of covariance, non-parametric tests, et cetera, logistical regression, everything we could get our hands on. So we looked at studies that described interviews, case studies, surveys, archival research. We looked at studies that included self-report, clinical assessment or court judgment studies, measurement tools, discussed sampling sources. Our goals, remember, were to review whether or not the research had moved past the greening stage to a blossoming stage of a maturing scientific area. Well, look at the way the studies developed across time. This figure illustrates the number of studies published each year, and the figure provides support. Look at the arc from a greening to a blossoming stage of this particular area of scientific inquiry and study. Remember, our second goal of this review was to delineate the contributions of parental alienation research to our understanding of the developmental processes and effects on children when interparental conflict leads to their alignment with one parent, and the rejection of the other parent. The peer-reviewed studies, theses, and dissertations on PA have focused on 16 general areas, which we summarized. And this figure demonstrates the concepts and pathways that have been studied so far, as well as the mediators that have been studied as well. All of these data modeling charts that Matt created are available in this article. Matt developed this pictorial representation of the increase in the cumulative increase in qualitative studies, the dark blue, and quantitative studies, the dark gray, as it progressed through time. Remember, anybody who knows anything about the development of science, particularly developmental psychology, knows that qualitative research is essential. And then as things develop and progress, quantitative methodologies can come to bear. But first we have to identify the phenomenon. We have to talk about what we're seeing. Okay, so you can see that over time, with the exception of a couple of years where the research was spiking, you can see again this trend over time from 1998 right straight up through 2020. This is the arc of a field developing from greening to blossoming. So, what were some of the areas that we discovered were being discussed in detail? One area that received the most research is the types of parental alienating behaviors that alienating parents used. Wow. This was a shock to me because I thought that dissertations, discussions about the actual things that these creepy, damaged parents do was underrepresented, and that idea on my part was falsified. Jennifer calls me up. She says, "No, look at the data. Look at my Excel sheet." And I'm going, "I'm too old to look at an Excel sheet." And she goes, "No, you're not. Look at page so and so." And lo and behold, there it was. Lots of studies about what they do, and studies about the manifestations of parental alienation in children. Studies about the direct relationship between parent alienating behaviors and parental alienation. Studies concerning other outcomes associated with parental alienation for children. Studies about other outcomes for parental alienation for alienated parents. And as this research was progressing, Jennifer and Amanda Sharples in Canada and I were developing ideas about, well, okay, we're seeing all this. Let's see if we can study who's actually doing the violence. Who's doing the violence? Are they the alienators or the alienated parents? So these were going along in tandem for a while. So the direct relationship between parental alienating behaviors and other outcomes for alienated parents and children were also studied. Third parties and institutions, justice system involvement studies were involved. Professional knowledge and attitudes about parental alienation and interventions were studied. The direct relationship of third parties like grandmas, grandpas, and institutions on alienated parent-child outcomes were also studied. Interventions were studied for severe parental alienation. Transfer of child custody to the alienated parent was reported as being very effective, along with structured interventions and coordination with court oversight. 27 articles that we found were concerned this. The characteristics of parents who have alienated their children, the gender of the alienating parent, the personality and behaviors of the alienating parents were also found in this large database of 213 articles. The prevalence and scope of the problem. I remember between the 2013 book that Bill and I did and the 2020 book, we had all kinds of fights about the appropriate methodology for an appropriate and accurate and reliable prevalence and study for prevalence study and an incidence study. Well, we found 13 articles that we looked at about prevalence. Prevalence of families where a parent was engaging in parental alienating behaviors, 12 more studies. The demographics of alienated children, no indication of any statistical differences on variables such as race, ethnicity, gender, or age. Okay, check that out. When we looked at all these studies, remember we started with 1,400 and something, and we got down to ground it down to in the most rigorous way we could to more than 200 of them, and we found no indication of any statistically significant differences on variables such as age, race, gender, ethnicity. That's key. In other words, nobody's safe. Measurement assessment articles were looked at. There was no indication of any statistically significant differences on variables such as race, ethnicity, gender, age in any of the measurement articles. So we looked through a wide range of studies and with diversities of methodologies, diversities of sampling strategies, diversities of measurement approaches. We also examined whether there's been a diversity in methods across all of these years. And in the table we showed before, there was tremendous diversity in the way in which people read about, talked about, studied, developed qualitative and quantitative studies about parental alienation. So across all 166 peer-reviewed studies, which was the largest cohort group, which were dissertations, master's theses, and book chapters, books were excluded in the analysis, but chapters that had empirical data were included. There were proportional and balanced numbers of studies using different research tools, assessment approaches, and sample sources. So, the indicators of a maturing field, an expanding literature, and a shift towards quantitative studies that test hypotheses generated by theory. This supports the proposition that parental alienation research has moved beyond the early stage of scientific development and is now blossoming. So it puts the lie to using the wrong tool to say it's in its infancy and there isn't any good research. Remember, our job for the last 5 years has been to directly deal with the memes. There's no good research. It's not in the DSM. It's not admissible. And this is the one, there's no good research. This one puts an end to that. Mine put an end to the, it's not admissible. Can't ever say that again. When Brian Ludmer and Christine Giancarlo and Jennifer and I redid that whole darn thing with trial court studies from Canada. And, I mean, you should have heard the language that came out of the Ludmer office when they were struggling to translate all these French decisions, right? But we worked on it and worked on it and worked on it. As Professor Giancarlo told you yesterday, we found remarkable similarities in the statistics that were found in the American appellate cases. So, I want to say it again. The indicators of a maturing field are an expanding literature and a shift toward quantitative studies that test hypotheses that are generated by theory and support a position that, and this supports a position that PA has moved beyond the early stages of scientific development and is now blossoming. As a field of study, PA is not methodologically flawed. And the reviewers at Developmental Psychology, an APA, premier APA journal, they were hot on this. They really wanted to see the numbers. And we said, open science framework. And they were, the comments that were coming back from the reviewers were laudatory. And can you say this more directly? Can you say this more succinctly? Well, when you say that, does it correlate to this? They were extremely supportive, and they were collaborating as good scientists do, because they were scientists of goodwill in a community of goodwill investigators. That's what science does. That's what science is. So they partnered with us, just like they, at the Journal of Family Violence, they partnered with Professor Amanda Sharples and Jennifer and I to point out who's doing the violence. It's not the alienated parent. So, I love this slide. What does that say? We looked at trial and appellate cases in the United States from 85 to 2018 and saw that the concept of PA, remember, as I said this a moment ago, is material. Remember, we had all this stuff about it's not admissible. Well, we demonstrated, and we demonstrated it again in Canada, that it's material, probative, relevant, not more prejudicial than probative, admissible, and it's given weight in the decision of the court. Those 6 criteria say if you suggest in any way that it's not admissible, you don't know what you're talking about. We'd already developed that. So, in summary, not only is it probative, material, probative, not more prejudicial than probative, relevant, admissible, and has weight as a concept of value to save children, but it's the scientific basis has been established conclusively by this study. Our summary is that given that nearly 40% of the studies on PA that we looked at have been published since 2016. We've been working. We deserve to give each other a pat on the back. We've been working hard on this to build good science. It falls to scholars, lawyers, practitioners to update their knowledge about parental alienation and incorporate these scientific advances. It's no longer tenable to dismiss the field as lacking in scientific status. Only by recognizing the legitimacy of parental alienation scholarship will developmental psychology sustain and enhance understanding of how and why parent-child relationships break down in the wake of interpersonal conflict, separation, and divorce. Thank you.